You kneel down beside the wilting tomato plant, your fingers brushing the soil, and you murmur something you'd never say out loud to another human being. A quiet promise that you'll figure out what's wrong, that you won't let this one die like the last one. That's the moment Seu James found himself in over and over for nearly a decade. He was 70 years old, had been gardening since he was a boy in the interior of Sao Paulo, and yet one specific plant in his backyard kept curling its leaves, turning yellow at the edges, and eventually collapsing into a brown, brittle heap. No matter what he did, he tried more water. He tried less water. He bought expensive fertilizer from the agricultural supply store, the kind with the bright packaging promising explosive growth. Nothing worked. And then one afternoon, kneeling in the dirt with the sun baking his shoulders, he made a decision that would cost him everything he had built in that garden. The plant in question was a rose bush. Not just any rose bush. It was a hybrid tea rose he had received from his daughter as a gift on his 63rd birthday. 7 years he had tended that bush, and for 7 years it had barely produced a single flower. The leaves would emerge in spring, pale and thin, then curl inward like tiny fists. By midsummer, the stems would develop black spots, and by autumn, the bush would look like a skeleton wrapped in dead leaves. Seu James tried every piece of advice he could find. He pruned it back hard. He sprayed it with a homemade fungicide made from baking soda and water. He even dug it up once, washed the roots, and replanted it in a different spot with fresh soil. Nothing changed. The official gardening wisdom, the kind you find in
Now,
books
if your
and on
roses are
television
struggling,
shows,
consider a
told
high-quality,
him to
balanced
feed the
fertilizer
rose
to
with a
replenish those
balanced
nutrients.
fertilizer, to water at the base, and to ensure good air circulation. He followed every instruction to the letter, and the bush kept dying anyway. That moment when the official advice fails you and you're left kneeling in the dirt with nothing but a dying plant, that's the moment this channel was built for. Subscribe if you want the chemistry behind every kitchen scrap, the studies that prove why common wisdom is wrong, and the step-by-step evidence that will change your soil forever. And here's what I need to know from you right now.
What was the one piece of advice you followed?
What was the one piece of advice you followed that turned out to be a lie? Type it in the comments. I want to see how many of us are fighting the same invisible battle. Here's what nobody talks about when they give you that advice. The soil in your garden is not a blank canvas. It is a living, breathing system with its own chemistry, its own microbial population, its own history. And Seu James's soil had a secret that the official manuals never warned him about. For years, he had been dumping coffee grounds around that rose bush, thinking he was giving it a nitrogen boost. He had read somewhere that coffee grounds acidify the soil, and since roses prefer slightly acidic conditions, he figured he was doing the right thing. Every morning, he would empty his coffee filter directly onto the soil around the base of the rose. He did this for 7 years. What he didn't know, what no one had told him, was that dried coffee grounds do not acidify soil the way everyone assumes. The ESALC study from 2019 measured exactly what happens. 8 days after burying dried coffee grounds, the pH neutralizes. It doesn't spike acidic. It neutralizes. And if you keep adding grounds every single day, you create a layer of organic matter that compacts, repels water, and suffocates the roots. The rose wasn't starving for nutrients. It was drowning in a blanket of misapplied kitchen waste. But the real trap, the one that cost Seu James everything, was something far more insidious than compacted coffee grounds. You see, when that rose bush started showing signs of stress, the yellowing leaves, the stunted growth, he responded the way any dedicated gardener would. He doubled down. He added more coffee grounds. He bought a premium rose fertilizer high in nitrogen and sprinkled it on top of the grounds. He watered more frequently, thinking the plant was thirsty. And each of these actions, taken individually, seemed logical. But together, they created a cascade of chemical reactions that turned the soil into a toxic soup. The excess nitrogen from the fertilizer, trapped under the layer of compacted coffee grounds, began to feed a specific type of anaerobic bacteria. Those bacteria produced ammonia as a byproduct, and ammonia in high concentrations burns root tissue. The rosebush wasn't suffering from a deficiency. It was being poisoned slowly by the very care Seu James thought he was giving it. Now, here's the part that makes this story hurt. Seu James had a neighbor, a woman named Dona Maria, who was 82 years old and grew the most magnificent roses you have ever seen. Her bushes were tall, thick, covered in blooms the size of your fist. Dona Maria never used coffee grounds. She never used synthetic fertilizer. She used crushed eggshells, banana peels buried in a specific way, and something she called the black
Ya le he dicho
water.
que no me interesa.
The
Pero
water
esto es
left
grave.
over from
Piénsalo
cooking
bien.
No hay nada
vegetables.
que pensar, déjelo así.
She had tried to tell Seu James more than once that he was doing something wrong. But he was a proud man, and he had read the books, and he trusted the official advice more than the intuition of an old woman
I
who
understand
couldn't
you're
even
upset.
read.
But this is
He
how it has
dismissed
to
her.
be.
He told her, politely, that his methods were backed by science, and then he went back to his dying rosebush, adding more coffee grounds, pouring more fertilizer, watching it wither day by day. It took a medical emergency to open his eyes. In the summer of his 71st year, Seu James collapsed in the garden. The paramedics found him lying next to the rosebush, his hands covered in black, compacted soil. The smell of ammonia rising from the ground around him. He had been breathing in those ammonia fumes for years, bent over the soil, inhaling the toxic byproduct of his own mistakes. The doctors told him his lungs were damaged, not beyond repair, but damaged enough that he would never garden the same way again. And as he lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, he finally asked himself the question he had been avoiding for 7 years. What if I was wrong about everything? That question, what if I was wrong, is the hardest one a gardener ever asks. But it's also the only one that opens the door to the real answers. If that question landed on you the way it landed on Seu James, subscribe to this channel. We dig into the chemistry, the studies, and the field-tested techniques that prove what the experts miss. And now, I want you to answer in the comments. Have you ever dismissed someone else's method because it didn't match what you read? Tell me about the moment
I
your
understand.
pride cost you a
We'll
plant.
be there as soon as we can.
This is the moment the belief demolition starts. Seu James called Dona Maria from the hospital. He asked her, with the humility of a man who had been broken open by his own pride, to tell him exactly what she did to her roses. And she did. She told him about the eggshells, how she dried them in the sun, ground them into a fine powder, using an old mortar and pestle, and sprinkled that powder around the base of her roses once a month. The Universidad Federal de Viçosa decomposition table shows exactly why this works. Whole eggshells take 6 months to break down in the soil, but powdered eggshells release calcium in 24 hours. Calcium is the element that strengthens cell walls in plants, making them resistant to disease and environmental stress. Every rosebush Dona Maria had was getting a steady, immediate supply of calcium. Seu James's roses were getting none. She told him about the banana peels, but not buried whole, the way he had tried once, the way that attracted every ant within 50 meters. She cut them into small pieces, about 2 centimeters square, and buried them at least 10 centimeters deep, directly under the root zone. Here's the chemistry behind that choice. Banana peels contain 42% potassium, which is essential for flower production. But if you bury the peel whole, it decomposes slowly, attracting pests and fermenting in the soil. If you cut it into small pieces and bury it deep, the decomposition happens underground, where earthworms find it, break it down, and transport the nutrients directly to the roots. The ant invasion is avoided because the scent doesn't travel upward through the air. It travels downward through the soil, where only the worms and microbes can detect it. And then she told him about the thing that changed everything, the black water, the water left over from boiling potatoes, carrots, and spinach. She told him to let it cool completely, then pour it directly onto the soil around the rose bush, but never on the leaves. The starch and minerals in that water feed the soil microbes, which in turn break down organic matter and make nutrients available to the plant. It's not magic. It's a mechanical chain of cause and effect. The boiling process leaches vitamins and minerals from the vegetables into the water. When you pour that water onto the soil, you're not watering the plant. You're feeding the ecosystem that feeds the plant. Seu James listened to all of this, and then he asked the question that would define the rest of his life. He asked Dona Maria why she had never told him this before, and she looked at him, this proud old man who had dismissed her for years and said something he would never forget. You weren't ready to hear it. Now, if the way that story lands on you feels familiar, stay with me. This is where the real trick starts. Because the mistake Seu James made is not unique to him. It is the most common error in modern gardening, and it comes from a simple cognitive bias. We trust the printed word more than the observed result. We read that coffee grounds acidify soil, and we keep adding them even when the plant shows signs of distress. We read that fertilizer makes plants grow, and we pour it on even when the leaves start curling. We trust the label more than the evidence in front of our eyes, and that trust, multiplied over years, is what kills the garden. Seu James left the hospital and went home to a garden that was nearly dead. The rose bush had lost almost all its leaves. The soil around it smelled sour and chemical. He could have given up. He could have dug it out and planted something else. But instead, he did something that most people never think to do. He took a soil sample and tested its pH using a simple home kit. The reading came back at 4.8. That is extremely acidic. Remember, the official advice says
the soil was lifeless. He had driven the pH down so low, the roots could no longer absorb nutrients.
Around 6.5. He had driven the pH down so low that the roots could no longer absorb nutrients. The nitrogen he had been adding was literally locked in the soil, unavailable to the plant, because the pH was wrong. All that fertilizer, all that effort, all that money, wasted, because the soil chemistry was fundamentally broken. A pH of 4.8, 7 years of coffee grounds, synthetic fertilizer, and a poisoned root zone, it all goes back to one number you never tested. That's why this channel is about the evidence, not the myth. Subscribe now so you see how Seu James fixed that pH and brought his rose bush back to life. Because the solution is in the kitchen, not the garden store. And leave a comment with the pH reading of your own soil if you've ever tested it. If you haven't, write never tested. I need to know how many of us are gardening blind. He followed Dona Maria's instructions to the letter. First, he stopped adding coffee grounds completely. He removed the top layer of compacted, sour-smelling soil and replaced it with fresh compost from her bin. Then he applied the powdered eggshells, a full cup mixed into the top 10 centimeters of soil. The calcium in those shells acts as a pH buffer, slowly raising the acidity toward neutral. He buried the banana peel pieces, cut small and deep, around the perimeter of the root zone, and he started watering with cooled potato water once a week. The results were not immediate. The first week, nothing changed. The second week, nothing changed. By the third week, he noticed a single new leaf emerging from the base of the bush. It was small, pale, fragile, but it was alive. Over the next 2 months, that rose bush transformed. The new leaves were darker, thicker, more resistant to the black spot fungus that had plagued it for years. 3 months after starting the new regimen, the bush produced its first flower in 7 years. It was small, imperfect, but it was a rose, and Seu James, kneeling beside it with his arthritic knees, wept. Not because of the flower, but because of what it represented, the realization that he had been his own worst enemy, that his pride and his trust in the official story had cost him nearly a decade of beauty. Some people hear this story and think it's too much work. You're not that person. You already know the difference between following instructions and understanding the chemistry. You already know that the soil beneath your feet is a living system that responds to what you put into it. And you already know that the best fertilizer in the world is useless if the pH is wrong, if the calcium is missing, if the potassium is locked away. The real secret of the 70-year-old gardener is not that he found a magical solution. It's that he finally admitted he was wrong. Here's where most people quit. They try 1 or 2 of these techniques, don't see instant results, and go back to the synthetic bag. But the ESALC study measured the pH shift on day 8, not day 1. Patience is the mechanism. The eggshells take 24 hours to release calcium. The banana peels take about 2 weeks to decompose enough for the potassium to become available. The potato water feeds the microbes immediately, but the microbes need time to multiply and process the organic matter into plant-available nutrients. Gardening on a chemical level is not about instant gratification. It's about setting up a system that delivers results over weeks and months. Now, imagine your rose bush 3 days from now, standing tall under the humid morning sun. The earthworm you attracted with the deep-buried banana peels still working its magic underground. The coffee grounds you stopped adding yesterday already beginning to break down without suffocating the roots. It's not a fantasy. It's a mechanical outcome of doing the right things in the right order. Seu James proved it with his own hands. Donna Maria proved it with 80 years of silent observation. And now you have the evidence in front of you. At what point in this story did you realize you've been making the same mistake? Write it in the comments. I need to know how many of us were taught the same wrong lesson. That more is better, that the label is always right, that pride is a substitute for observation. Because the garden doesn't care about your pride. It only responds to what you actually do. And the only mistake that costs you everything is the one you refuse to correct.